The courthouse in Maplewood, a quiet town in the United States, was usually a place for minor disputes, land disagreements, traffic violations, and the occasional theft trial. But on this particular day, the atmosphere was anything but ordinary. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of anxious family members. Reporters tapped their pens against notepads, and every corner of the room hummed with anticipation. At the very center of it all sat a little girl, 3-year-old Emily Parker. Her big brown eyes darted around curiously, taking in the intimidating space, though she hardly understood the gravity of the situation. Dressed in a pale yellow dress, her favorite, she clutched a small stuffed bunny tightly against her chest, a silent source of comfort in a world that seemed too loud, too grown-up, and far too heavy for her tiny shoulders. Her mother, Laura Parker, sat beside her, one arm wrapped protectively around her daughter's small frame. Laura's face bore the unmistakable marks of sleepless nights, dark circles under her eyes, a pale complexion, and a constant air of tension. Across the room, at the defendant's table, sat Daniel Parker, Emily's father. His once strong posture now seemed weary, his eyes red from both exhaustion and fear. Daniel had been accused of crimes that could ruin not only his life, but also the life of his young daughter. Prosecutors argued that he was guilty of theft, fraud, and intimidation, charges that carried heavy consequences. His defense attorney claimed he was being framed by someone inside the department, that the evidence had been twisted. For weeks, the town had buzzed with speculation, friends and neighbors whispering in grocery aisles and coffee shops. Today, the courtroom was bursting at the seams, with onlookers eager to see how this story would unfold. Reporters had traveled from nearby cities, eager to cover a small-town drama that seemed larger than life. The scent of old wood and polished floors mixed with the faint aroma of coffee wafting in from the hallways. The heavy oak doors creaked as more spectators slipped in, each seat filling quickly until only standing room remained. Judge Henry Wallace presided over the case. Known for his stern demeanor and sharp mind, he commanded respect the moment he entered. His robe swayed as he stepped up to the bench, his gavel striking with a resounding crack that silenced the chatter. His eyes scanned the room with an intensity that made even seasoned lawyers sit straighter. "Court is now in session," he declared, his deep voice echoing through the chamber. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Karen Mitchell, rose with confidence, her voice clear and precise as she outlined the case against Daniel Parker. She spoke of falsified documents, missing funds, and suspicious encounters. Every word was crafted to paint Daniel as a man who had betrayed trust, a man unworthy of his family or his community. Daniel's attorney, Michael Grant, countered firmly, reminding the jury and the judge that not all was as it seemed. "This case is riddled with inconsistencies," he said, gesturing toward a stack of files. "And we intend to prove that Daniel Parker is the victim of manipulation, not the perpetrator of a crime." The tension between the two attorneys crackled in the air, their words colliding like swords in battle. But amid this verbal war, Emily shifted slightly in her seat. Her legs dangled off the bench, too short to reach the floor, and she fiddled absent-mindedly with the ears of her stuffed bunny. To her, this wasn't about evidence or charges. It was about her father sitting across the room, looking so far away, yet so close. Then came the entrance of the police K-9 unit. The doors at the back swung open, and in walked Officer Ryan Blake, a tall, broad-shouldered man dressed in uniform, his hand gripping the leash of a well-trained German shepherd named Rex. The dog's nails clicked against the polished floor as it walked with precision, its eyes alert, its ears pricked. The arrival of a K-9 unit was routine in cases of this magnitude, particularly when tensions ran high. The dog was there to maintain security, ensure order, and serve as a silent reminder of law enforcement's presence. Most in the courtroom hardly glanced at the pair after all, Police dogs were a common sight at such hearings. But Emily noticed. Her gaze locked on the animal instantly, her little brows furrowing, while everyone else leaned forward to catch every word spoken by the attorneys. Emily's attention narrowed entirely to the canine and its handler. Her small body stiffened, her fingers tightening around her toy bunny until its fabric ears wrinkled. Lavra noticed the change in her daughter and bent down to whisper, "It's just a dog, sweetie. Nothing to be scared of." But Emily didn't answer. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes never leaving the handler. For a moment, she seemed frozen in place, as though her young mind was processing something she couldn't fully articulate. The sound of voices faded for her. The shuffle of papers, the gavel striking, the prosecutor's sharp tone all blurred into background noise. To Emily, there was only the handler, his tall frame looming, and the dog obediently sitting by his side. Something about the man stirred a deep discomfort in her, one that she couldn't explain in words, but felt with every fiber of her being. As the proceedings carried on, Laura shifted uncomfortably. She sensed her daughter's unease, but in a room filled with adults focused on serious matters, what could a 3-year-old possibly contribute? Surely it was just nerves, she told herself. Emily had been through so much already. Maybe the sight of a uniform was enough to scare her. But Emily wasn't scared of the uniform. She wasn't even scared of the dog. She was staring at the man himself, the way his jaw tightened, the way his hand gripped the leash, the way his eyes flickered restlessly around the room. Judge Wallace cleared his throat, snapping the attention of the courtroom back to the case at hand. Witnesses were called, testimonies were given, and the weight of the accusations loomed large. Daniel Parker sat silently, his hands folded, occasionally glancing toward his daughter, who watched him with innocent loyalty. Then, without warning, Emily shifted again. This time, it wasn't a small movement. She straightened her tiny back, raised her arm, and pointed. Her finger, small yet steady, aimed not at the dog, but directly toward the handler. Her voice, soft yet strangely commanding, cut through the silence. "Bad man?" The words were barely louder than a whisper, but they carried through the courtroom like a clap of thunder. Heads turned, jaws dropped, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The attorneys stopped mid-sentence, the judge froze with his gavel in hand, and the entire room turned toward the source of the declaration. Emily, still pointing, repeated it again. Her little voice quivered, but there was no mistaking the conviction in her tone. Bad man. The hush that followed was unlike anything the courtroom had ever known. It wasn't just silence. It was the kind of silence that prickled skin and made hearts race. Lavra tried to lower her daughter's hand, whispering urgently. "Emily, no, sweetheart," bunked, but it was too late. The words had been spoken, and there was no taking them back. The handler shifted uncomfortably, his face tightening. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching furiously across paper. The prosecutor glanced at the judge, who now looked deeply unsettled. A 3-year-old girl, without evidence or agenda, had just thrown the courtroom into chaos with 2 simple words. And everyone knew things would never be the same again. Phrase seemed impossibly heavy, coming from the lips of a 3-year-old. The courtroom, filled with lawyers, officers, and townsfolk, suddenly seemed fragile, as though everything they believed about the trial could crack at any moment. Emily still pointed, her arm stretched toward the police K9 handler. Her finger trembled, not from hesitation, but from the sheer determination of a child who knew what she had seen, what she had felt. The judge was the first to break the silence. Clearing his throat, he adjusted his glasses, trying to reassert control. "Order in the court," he said firmly, his gavel striking once. But the command carried less authority than usual. Even Judge Wallace, known for his unshakable demeanor, couldn't ignore what had just happened. His eyes, sharp and probing, lingered on the little girl before shifting to the handler. The handler, Officer Ryan Blake, stiffened. His jaw clenched, his knuckles tightened on the leash, and his usually steady posture wavered. A German shepherd beside him, Rex, sat obediently, tilting its head as if sensing its partner's unease. The defense attorney, Michael Grant, stood quickly, forcing a smile that came out thin and strained. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is the imagination of a toddler. Children say all sorts of things, sometimes fantastical, sometimes nonsensical. It's inappropriate and irrelevant to allow such a statement to influence these proceedings." His words came rapid fire, but even he could feel the unease in the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching like insects in the silence. Every spectator leaned forward, their attention no longer on the carefully prepared arguments of lawyers, but on the trembling finger of a child and the man it accused. The prosecutor, Karen Mitchell, remained seated, but her eyes gleamed. She hadn't expected this twist, but she wasn't about to dismiss it either. Slowly, she rose from her chair, her tone measured. "Your Honor, while the defense may claim this is imagination, the statement made by the child cannot be ignored." She pointed clearly at Officer Blake and repeated herself twice. "If there is any prior connection between this officer and the child or her family, it is our duty to investigate it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Some nodded, others whispered. The energy in the room shifted from curiosity to suspicion. Laura Parker, Emily's mother, flushed with embarrassment and fear. She bent low, whispering urgently into her daughter's ear. "Emily, sweetheart, it's okay. You don't have to say anything else. Just sit quietly, okay?" But Emily shook her head, her little curls bouncing. Her wide eyes stayed fixed on Officer Blake. She clutched her stuffed bunny tighter and whispered again. More softly this time, almost like she was speaking only to her mother. "Bad man." Laura's heart raced. She remembered that night vividly, the night Officer Blake had visited their home, unannounced, when Daniel was first under suspicion. He had smiled too much, his eyes wandering, his tone condescending. She had brushed it off then, chalking it up to nerves. But now, hearing her daughter, who had only ever spoken the truth as children do, her stomach twisted. Judge Wallace leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension. Officer Blake stepped forward. The handler hesitated, his boots scraping against the floor as he obeyed. He stopped near the witness stand, his expression controlled, but his eyes betraying a flicker of unease. The German shepherd padded loyally beside him, sitting once more at his heel. "Officer Blake," the judge continued, "have you had any prior interactions with the Parker family outside of your duties as a canine handler in this courtroom?" Blake's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "No, Your Honor. My role is strictly professional." His tone was steady, but his shifting gaze told a different story. The prosecutor's voice cut in, sharp as a blade. "And yet the child seems to recognize you. Children, as defense counsel pointed out, do have imaginations, but they also have instincts. Strong ones. They don't fabricate fear without reason." Michael Grant jumped to his feet. "Objection. This is outrageous speculation. We are putting weight on the babbling of a toddler. It has no place in a courtroom of law." Judge Wallace raised his hand, silencing both attorneys. He turned his attention back to Emily. For a moment, the stern lines of his face softened. "Young lady," he said gently, "can you tell me why you said that?" Emily blinked, clutching her bunny, her lips pressing into a pout. She was 3 years old, too small to understand the magnitude of the question, too innocent to calculate the impact of her words. She simply whispered, "He came home. He made Mommy cry." The entire courtroom gasped. Laura's hand flew to her mouth, tears stinging her eyes. She hadn't realized Emily had noticed that night that her daughter had been awake, peeking from the staircase when Officer Blake stood in their living room, his words sharp, his presence intimidating. The judge leaned back slowly, his expression unreadable. "We will take a brief recess," he announced. His gavel came down with a crack, but this time it didn't silence the whispers, it only fueled them. As the jury filed out and the attorneys gathered their notes, the room buzzed with speculation. Reporters rushed to the doors, already preparing headlines. Child accuses officer in court. Canine handler under scrutiny. The story was no longer about Daniel Parker's guilt or innocence. It was about something bigger, something darker, that had just been pulled into the light. Officer Blake retreated toward the back of the courtroom, his face pale, his hands gripping the leash tighter than necessary. Rex, the dog, whined softly, as though uneasy with the tension radiating from its handler. Lavra gathered Emily into her arms, her mind spinning. She hadn't wanted her daughter involved, hadn't wanted her innocence dragged into this grim process. Yet Emily's tiny voice had spoken truth in a way no adult dared. Daniel Parker, sitting at the defendant's table, felt something he hadn't felt in weeks' hope. His daughter's words had cracked a hole in the wall of accusations that surrounded him. It was faint, but it was there, and he clung to it desperately. Outside, the town of Maplewood waited. By evening, the news would spread like wildfire, and the people who had already judged Daniel guilty would have to reckon with a new possibility, that perhaps the wrong man had been accused, and the corruption ran deeper than they ever imagined. Emily, unaware of the storm she had unleashed, simply yawned and rested her head against her mother's shoulder. To her, it was simple. She had seen a man who frightened her and told the truth as she knew it. But to everyone else in that courtroom, her words were a spark, and sparks have a way of igniting fires. The recess had done little to cool the tension in the room. If anything, the atmosphere grew heavier when the participants returned. Reporters had already spilled the story to the outside world. Headlines were appearing online within minutes. What should have been a routine continuation of Daniel Parker's trial was now a media storm centered on a toddler's 2 words. When the judge re-entered, his face was set in stern concentration, but even he couldn't disguise the faint crease of unease that lined his brow. The gavel struck, a sound reverberating through the chamber like a warning bell. "Court is back in session," Judge Wallace announced, though his voice carried less of its usual iron certainty. All eyes turned not to the defendant, nor to the attorneys, but to the canine handler. Officer Ryan Blake stood near the back, his jaw locked, his hand still gripping Rex's leash, so tightly his knuckles whitened. The German shepherd sat obediently, calm and steady, an image of loyalty that sharply contrasted with the visible unease of its handler. The defense attorney, Michael Grant, leapt at the opportunity to redirect the court. "Your Honor," he began with exaggerated calm, "what occurred earlier was nothing more than a misunderstanding. A 3-year-old child, no matter how precocious, cannot be relied upon to make serious accusations. We must not lose focus. The charges against my client, serious charges, should not be overshadowed by an outburst from a toddler who may have confused memory with imagination." He spoke smoothly, but even as he did, he sensed the courtroom wasn't convinced. Jurors shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. Reporters leaned forward like predators scenting blood. Corinne Mitchell, the prosecutor, rose to her feet. Her expression was calm, but her tone carried deliberate weight. "Your Honor, no one is suggesting we place the entire burden of this case on the words of a child. However, when a child points at a sworn officer of the law and identifies him as a bad man, in connection with behavior that may have impacted this very trial, we cannot dismiss it outright. At the very least, this requires examination." Murmurs rose in the gallery, the words "bad man" rippling through the rows like an echo. Laura Parker, seated with Emily nestled against her, shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. She wanted nothing more than to protect her daughter from the spotlight, but there was no undoing what had been said. Judge Wallace rubbed his temple. The child's words cannot be admitted as direct evidence. That much is clear. However, they raise a serious question about the integrity of this trial. Therefore, I am ordering a preliminary inquiry into Officer Blake's involvement with the Parker family. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, even stifled shouts filled the chamber. The gavel slammed down repeatedly. "Order! Order in this court!" The judge bellowed, his patience fraying. Officer Blake stepped forward, his voice tense. "Your Honor, I protest. I have done nothing wrong. My record speaks for itself. I have served with distinction, and this accusation from a toddler, no less, is absurd." But his anger, rather than clearing suspicion, only seemed to tighten the noose of doubt around him. Emily whimpered quietly, burying her face into her mother's chest at the sound of his voice. Karen Mitchell's eyes sharpened. "With all due respect, Officer Blake, records can be altered. Reputations can be built on silence. If you have nothing to hide, then an inquiry will only confirm your integrity. Why resist it?" The handler's lips pressed into a thin line. His silence spoke louder than words. Daniel Parker, sitting at the defense table, felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks' hope. For so long, every piece of evidence had painted him guilty, every testimony stacked against him. But now, the very foundation of the case was trembling, not because of his lawyer's arguments, but because of his daughter's innocent declaration. The jury watched closely. Their faces, once hardened against Daniel, now carried traces of doubt. Michael Grant tried desperately to regain control. "Your Honor, I insist we focus on the charges at hand. We cannot derail these proceedings based on hearsay from a toddler." But Judge Wallace shook his head. "Mr. Grant, justice is not a straight line. It demands that we consider every angle when integrity is called into question. If the officer in charge of certain evidence is compromised, then the credibility of this case itself is compromised. That cannot be ignored." Another wave of whispers swept through the gallery. People who had come expecting to see a guilty man sentenced were now shifting in their seats, wondering if they had misjudged everything. Lavra clutched Emily tighter, whispering into her hair, "It's okay, sweetheart. Mommy's here." Emily, still holding her stuffed bunny, mumbled softly, "Bad man," one last time before falling silent. Every ear caught it. Every pen scribbled it down. And though the judge did not officially recognize it, those two words seemed to linger, clinging to the walls of the courtroom like an accusation no one could erase. The prosecutor leaned into her table, whispering something to her assistant. Papers shuffled. A phone buzzed. Pieces were moving, quietly but deliberately. This wasn't just about winning the case anymore. It was about uncovering the truth. Outside, reporters rushed to file updates. Television crews set up cameras on the courthouse steps. By evening, the entire town of Maplewood, and soon the whole country, would know the story. A 3-year-old girl who pointed at a police officer in open court and called him a bad man inside. Tension thickened. The defense team huddled around Daniel, whispering strategies, but their voices betrayed panic. Across the room, Karen Mitchell scribbled notes, already plotting the next line of questioning. The judge sat in silence for a moment longer, before finally speaking. "This trial has taken an unexpected turn. For the sake of justice, and for the integrity of these proceedings, I am instructing an independent review of Officer Blake's role in this case. Until then, his duties in this courtroom are suspended. Bailiff, please escort him out." The order landed like a thunderclap. Gasps and shouts filled the air. Blake's face darkened with fury, his eyes flashing toward the Parker family before he was led toward the exit. Rex, obedient as ever, padded beside him, unaware of the storm brewing around his handler. For a moment, everyone sat stunned. A seasoned officer had just been removed. A child's words had shifted the course of a trial, and the truth suddenly felt uncertain. Daniel Parker exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting to his daughter. She was too young to understand what she had done, too innocent to know the weight of her words. But to him, she wasn't just his daughter, she was his lifeline, his flicker of light in the darkness. As the doors closed behind Officer Blake, silence settled once more. But it was not the silence of order. It was the silence of suspicion, of doubt, of the sense that something bigger was unraveling before their eyes. And in that silence, one thought pulsed through every mind present. If the child was right, then the entire foundation of this trial was about to collapse. The air inside the courtroom seemed heavier than ever. The judge had just called for a short recess after Emily's startling words echoed across the chamber. For many, the shock hadn't yet worn off. A toddler pointing toward a police dog and uttering "bad man" had derailed the entire momentum of the trial. But as the minutes ticked by, whispers among the jurors, reporters, and spectators grew louder. The focus wasn't just on the dog anymore. It was on the uniformed handler standing beside it, whose stiff posture betrayed more than simple professionalism. Detective Harris, the canine officer in question, tried to maintain composure. His hand gripped the leash tightly, knuckles pale under the strain. For years, Harris had been a decorated officer, praised for his discipline and loyalty. Yet, there was something about his nervousness now that gnawed at the prosecutor's instincts. Children, after all, had a way of noticing things adults dismissed. When court resumed, the prosecutor stood immediately. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to question Officer Harris directly." The defense attorney shot up like a coiled spring. "Objection. This has nothing to do with the case at hand. We are allowing a toddler's imagination to derail the proceedings." But the judge leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "Overruled for now. But proceed carefully, Counselor." The prosecutor approached Harris. "Officer, do you recall having any prior contact with the family of Emily, the little girl present here today?" Harris cleared his throat. I may have visited their residence once for a routine welfare check. Standard procedure, nothing more." Emily tugged at her mother's sleeve, her voice quiet but determined. "Bad man." She pointed again, not at the dog, but unmistakably at Harris himself. The courtroom gasped in unison. Emily's mother, pale and trembling, looked as though something had clicked inside her memory. She whispered, almost to herself, "That day. He came to the house." The prosecutor caught it. "Ma'am, could you elaborate?" Her hands shook as she gripped the railing in front of her. "Months ago, before the trial even began, Officer Harris came to my door. He said he was checking in because of concerns about my husband. But the way he looked at us, the way he spoke it, didn't feel right. I tried to brush it off, but Emily cried all night after that visit." The defense jumped in again. "Speculation. None of this is admissible." But the judge raised a hand. "Enough. I want to hear where this is going." The prosecutor pressed on. "Officer Harris, did you file an official report for that visit?" Harris's face reddened. I don't recall the exact paperwork." The room stirred uneasily. Police officers lived by paperwork. Not recalling was nearly unthinkable. Sensing his hesitation, the prosecutor requested an immediate background check on Harris's past reports. With the judge's reluctant approval, investigators hurried out to dig deeper. The courtroom, though still buzzing with tension, settled into an uneasy quiet while proceedings were temporarily paused. During that break, Emily sat quietly in her mother's lap, drawing invisible shapes on the wooden bench with her tiny finger. She had no idea that her words had cracked open a hidden truth. Reporters scribbled furiously, exchanging glances that said they knew a bigger story was forming right before their eyes. When the investigators returned, their findings were grim. Several reports linked to Harris appeared inconsistent, dates altered, and signatures missing. The routine welfare check, he mentioned, nowhere in the official system. The prosecutor rose, his voice sharp. Your Honor, this officer's credibility is now in serious question. We request that Officer Harris be temporarily relieved from duty until a full inquiry can be made. The judge studied Harris intently. Officer, is there anything you wish to say in your defense at this moment? Harris's lips pressed into a thin line. His silence spoke louder than any denial. After a tense pause, the judge nodded to the bailiff. Escort Officer Harris from the courtroom. Until this matter is clarified, his presence is a distraction to these proceedings. Gasps rippled through the room as Harris was led out, his once proud posture slumped. Emily watched him go, her small voice carrying once again in the hushed silence. Bad man. For the first time since the trial began, the defense team looked rattled. Their key reliance on police testimony had now been thrown into doubt. The prosecutor, meanwhile, felt the shift in momentum. It wasn't victory yet, but it was the kind of break no one could have predicted. As reporters rushed outside to send breaking headlines to their newsrooms, Emily's mother buried her face in her hands. She hadn't wanted her daughter anywhere near this trial, but now it seemed fate had placed the child exactly where she was meant to be. And so, with one innocent phrase, the case against Emily's father began to unravel. The courtroom had been set on a new course, one that none of them had foreseen. The courtroom was a storm of murmurs after Officer Harris had been escorted out. The defense sat rigid, whispering hurriedly among themselves, while the prosecutor leaned back in his chair, calculating. The case had already been unusual, but now it had transformed into something far more dangerous. What had started as a custody battle with criminal allegations was now tangled with police corruption, a child's testimony, and the possibility of a wrongful conviction. Emily, still perched on her mother's lap, played with the edge of her dress, blissfully unaware that she had just triggered the unraveling of a man's career. Her innocence contrasted with the gravity of the moment, and the sight made the judge pause before striking the gavel. This court will reconvene tomorrow morning to allow time for an internal review. In light of the inconsistencies surrounding Officer Harris, his past involvement in this case will be re-examined. The words hit like thunder. Tomorrow. Everything hinged on tomorrow. As the court emptied, reporters scrambled to get quotes. Some called it the testimony of the century, while others whispered that it was nothing but a distraction. Emily's mother shielded her child from the flashing cameras, whispering softly, "It's all right, baby. You did nothing wrong." That night, investigators combed through Harris's history. At first glance, his file painted him as a decorated officer, multiple commendations, years of service, and spotless reports. But the deeper they looked, the more cracks appeared. Buried inside overlooked files were complaints neighbors accusing him of harassment, suspects claiming evidence had gone missing after his searches, and colleagues quietly noting his aggressive tactics. Most had been dismissed as unproven, but a pattern began to form, one too sharp to ignore. By midnight, one discovery stood out. Harris had filed critical evidence in Emily's father's case, evidence that painted him as guilty. But when forensic analysts re-examined it, they found clear signs of tampering. Fingerprint smudges didn't match the logs. Timestamps didn't align. Some items appeared planted. The lead investigator, Agent Morrison, slammed the report onto his desk. If this holds up, then Harris may have orchestrated an entire false narrative. And if that's true, The wrong man has been sitting in chains. Morning came, and the courtroom buzzed with an intensity no one could hide. The gallery was packed journalists, townspeople, activists, even off-duty officers who wanted to see what would unfold. The judge entered, solemn and prepared. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, the overnight investigation has yielded troubling results. We have strong reason to believe that Officer Harris manipulated evidence tied directly to the defendant's case. Furthermore, irregularities in his past reports suggest this may not be an isolated incident." The defense attorney shot up. "This is outrageous. Are we now basing criminal cases on the babbling of a 3-year-old? This child points her finger, says 2 words, and suddenly years of police work are dismissed. Your Honor, this is theater, not justice." But the prosecutor was ready. He presented the files, the altered logs, the evidence that couldn't withstand forensic scrutiny. "This isn't theater. This is fact. Without Officer Harris, the cornerstone of the prosecution's evidence collapses. And it was Emily's innocence that forced us to look deeper." The judge examined the files, lips pressed into a grim line. The jury leaned forward, unable to hide their curiosity. What once seemed like a straightforward conviction was dissolving before their eyes. In the middle of this storm, Emily once again drew attention without meaning to. She reached for her mother's hand, her little voice carrying over the silence. "Mommy, Doggie's sad." The K-9 sat alone, tethered by another officer now. Its usual proud stance seemed subdued, as if sensing the weight of its handler's disgrace. The courtroom softened for a moment, everyone reminded that even loyal animals could be tangled in the failings of their humans. The prosecutor continued, "Your Honor, we request that all evidence tied to Harris be suppressed pending further inquiry. And we demand that his role in this case be fully investigated." The judge nodded slowly. "Granted. Until we know the full extent of Officer Harris's misconduct, this court cannot rely on his contributions. Effective immediately, his involvement is suspended from record." The gavel strike sent shockwaves. The defense team's faces fell. Without Harris, their strategy collapsed like a house of cards. Outside, cameras flashed as the news spread like wildfire. Headlines exploded. Toddler Sparks investigation into police corruption. Officer suspended after courtroom outburst. Child's testimony may overturn wrongful conviction. Emily's mother shielded her again, whispering, "You're braver than you know, sweetheart." But not everyone saw Emily as a hero. In dark corners of the town, some muttered about how dangerous it was to let a child influence a trial. Online, skeptics debated whether she'd been coached. Police unions scrambled to defend their ranks, while reform advocates seized the moment as proof of systemic problems. Meanwhile, Emily's father sat in holding, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time in months. He had told anyone who would listen that he was innocent, but no one believed him. Now, the tide was turning, and it was his daughter, his little girl, who had unknowingly lit the path. Later that day, a deeper bombshell arrived. Investigators uncovered encrypted files on Harris's personal devices. Hidden inside were communications with known criminals, including one message that suggested he had been paid to ensure certain convictions, stuck Emily's father among them. The revelation hit the courthouse like a lightning strike. Harris wasn't just a corrupt officer. He was potentially part of a larger network. The prosecutor's voice trembled slightly when he spoke. "Your Honor, what we've uncovered doesn't just exonerate the defendant. It raises the possibility that others, too, may have been wrongfully convicted. Officer Harris is now under federal investigation." The courtroom erupted into gasps and murmurs. The defense, who had once mocked Emily's words, sat silent, faces pale. In the middle of the chaos, Emily leaned her head against her mother's chest, exhausted from the long day. She didn't know she had just shifted the scales of justice. or that her simple words had sparked an investigation that might free her father and uncover a corrupt web. To her, the world was simple. She had seen a bad man, and she had spoken the truth. And in that truth, the entire courtroom and soon, the nation was forced to confront just how fragile justice could be when left in the wrong hands. The case had changed forever. The story was no longer about one man's guilt. It was about uncovering how deep Harris's deception went, and who else might be hiding behind his shield. The courtroom was no longer the measured, orderly place it had been only days before. Instead, it throbbed with tension, disbelief, and anger, as though everyone inside had been thrust into a whirlwind they hadn't agreed to enter. When Judge Callahan struck his gavel to restore order, the sound was sharp, but largely drowned out by the low rumble of voices echoing through the gallery. Silence. The judge roared, his tone commanding. Slowly, the chatter died down, though the anxiety lingered like smoke after a fire. At the defense table, Emily's father sat straighter, though the chains around his wrists still weighed him down. For the first time since his arrest, his eyes carried not despair, but a fragile spark of hope. His lawyer whispered something urgent in his ear, but his gaze was fixed on his daughter across the room. Little Emily, playing absently with a ribbon in her hand, was oblivious to the fact that she had just cracked open the foundation of the very case that threatened to take her father away forever. The prosecutor rose first, papers in hand. Your Honor, with the evidence of Officer Harris's corruption now under federal review, we must acknowledge that the case presented to this jury has been irreparably compromised. Harris's testimony, his reports, and the physical evidence he processed can no longer be trusted. Gasps swept through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, and the click of cameras punctuated the heavy silence. The defense attorney leaped up in protest. This is madness. You're telling me that because of a child's outburst, the entirety of a sworn officer's work is dismissed? We are not here to debate Officer Harris's career. We are here to determine whether this man, he jabbed a finger toward Emily's father, committed the crimes he's charged with. Harris may have made mistakes, but that doesn't erase the mountain of evidence against the defendant. Objection, the prosecutor snapped. That mountain of evidence was built on Harris's foundation. Without it, there is nothing but suspicion and hearsay. The judge raised a hand. Enough, both of you. The jury shifted uncomfortably. They had been told they were weighing facts. Now they were being asked to weigh uncertainty, mistrust, and corruption. Some cast furtive glances toward Emily, as if still trying to process how a toddler had thrown the entire system into disarray. During the recess, chaos bled beyond the courtroom walls. Outside, the courthouse steps were swarmed with protesters and counter-protesters. Some held signs that read, "Free the innocent," while others shouted, "Justice is not child's play." The media vans lined the street, their reporters broadcasting live updates to a nation hungry for every twist. Inside, Emily's mother sat quietly in a corner, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of water. A court officer had offered it to her, but she could barely lift it to her lips. Her little girl's words, innocent as they were, had pulled her family into a storm she couldn't control. "Do you realize what you've done?" One reporter whispered to another nearby. "This isn't just about one case anymore. If Harris tampered here, what about the others? This could blow the lid off the entire department." When court resumed, the prosecutor's office brought in Agent Morrison, the federal investigator now leading the Harris inquiry. He stood tall, his expression grave. "Your Honor, preliminary findings indicate that Officer Harris engaged in a consistent pattern of misconduct. Evidence suggests he may have falsified records, intimidated witnesses, and suppressed exonerating information. Furthermore, there are indications that these actions were not isolated to this case alone." The courtroom erupted once again. The judge's gavel hammered, but this time the noise was unstoppable. Spectators shouted in disbelief, some calling for Harris's arrest, others demanding mistrials for cases he had worked on. At the defense table, panic flickered across the faces of the attorneys. Their carefully woven arguments had unraveled, thread by thread, leaving them exposed. Without Harris, their ability to argue the father's guilt had been shattered. Emily's father leaned forward, eyes wide, as though straining to hear every word. His lawyer whispered fiercely, "Stay calm. Don't react too strongly. We need to let this play out." But calm was impossible when the weight of false accusations had pressed down on him for so long. For the first time, the cracks in his prison bars were visible. The judge called a private session in his chambers with both legal teams and Agent Morrison. Behind closed doors, the discussions turned heated. "We cannot proceed as though nothing has changed," the prosecutor argued. "The jury has been poisoned by corrupted evidence. We cannot seek a conviction in good faith." The defense lawyer slammed a fist on the table. "And what of the girl's testimony? You're allowing the babble of a 3-year-old to dictate the fate of this trial. She doesn't know what she saw. She doesn't understand the difference between right and wrong." Agent Morrison spoke evenly. "With respect, counselor, this isn't about Emily's words anymore. It's about what her words revealed. Without her, Harris would still be on that stand. The evidence doesn't lie. Harris did." The room fell into heavy silence. For all the defense's protests, there was no argument against tampered reports, forged signatures, and hidden files. Back in the courtroom, the jury was visibly unsettled. Some whispered among themselves, others stared at the defendant with newfound doubt. The scales were shifting, and everyone could feel it. The judge finally addressed the room. "This trial has taken an extraordinary turn. The allegations against Officer Harris are severe and cannot be ignored. Effective immediately, I am suspending deliberations until the federal inquiry concludes. In the meantime, this defendant remains in custody. But the court recognizes that the integrity of this case is compromised." The sound of his gavel marked the official pause, but the chaos continued long after. As people filed out, Emily reached out her tiny hand toward the K9, who had been reassigned to another officer. The dog leaned forward, pressing its nose gently against her paw. For a moment, the noise and chaos faded into the background. A little girl and a loyal animal, both caught in the storm of adult corruption, found solace in each other's presence. Her mother whispered, tears welling in her eyes, "You've done something no one else could, sweetheart." Emily only smiled, stroking the dog's head. To her, the world wasn't about evidence, corruption, or trials. It was about right and wrong. And she had known, from the moment Harris walked into her home, that he wasn't right. By evening, the story had spread nationwide. News anchors debated the role of children in trials. Legal experts dissected the collapse of the prosecution's case, and ordinary citizens argued in coffee shops and online forums. Was justice being served, or was it being sabotaged by the innocence of a child? One thing was certain. The courtroom had been thrown into chaos, and nothing about the case or the people involved would ever be the same again. The courthouse was buzzing like a hive when the trial resumed the next day. Reporters crowded the steps, their microphones thrust toward anyone who might utter a word. Protesters chanted slogans, some in support of Emily's father, others furious about the corruption scandal rocking their police department. The chaos outside mirrored the tension within, but behind the noise, a quiet determination grew in those who knew the truth was finally clawing its way to the surface. Inside, Emily's father sat at the defense table, his head bowed. The chains around his wrists still clinked softly whenever he moved, but his eyes burned with hope. For months he had insisted he was innocent, and now, after so much despair, The cracks in the false case against him had begun to widen. He looked at Emily in the gallery, her small body curled in her mother's arms, and felt a swell of pride and gratitude. She had saved him without even knowing it. Judge Callahan struck his gavel. This court is back in session. In light of new evidence regarding Officer Harris, we will hear testimony from the federal investigative team before determining how to proceed. The air stilled. Everyone knew this could change everything. Agent Morrison stepped forward, documents in hand. His voice was steady, his demeanor calm, but his words landed like hammers. Your Honor, members of the court, our investigation into Officer Harris has revealed a pattern of deliberate misconduct. We have evidence that he falsified reports, planted incriminating material, and destroyed records that would have favored the defendant. A wave of gasps swept through the gallery. Emily's mother closed her eyes, tears spilling down her cheeks. Her husband wasn't crazy, wasn't guilty, he had been framed. Morrison continued, in particular, we found that fingerprints on a key piece of evidence introduced against the defendant were altered. The prints attributed to him were actually transferred from an unrelated case file. Furthermore, time-stamped surveillance footage shows Officer Harris entering the evidence locker at hours outside of his authorization. The defense attorney slammed his palm on the table. Your Honor, this is outrageous. If what the agent says is true, then everything against my client collapses. The prosecutor, though visibly shaken, nodded. We cannot, in good conscience, pursue this case any further without admitting that the foundation has been compromised beyond repair. The judge leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. So, Agent Morrison, are you telling this court that the defendant may indeed be innocent? Morrison hesitated, careful with his words. Your Honor, what I am saying is that the evidence tying him to the alleged crimes is tainted. Without Harris's manufactured reports, there is nothing that legally binds this man to guilt. The jury stirred, whispering among themselves. Just days earlier, many of them had looked at Emily's father with suspicion. Now, those same faces looked uncertain, even guilty for having judged him too quickly. Emily's mother reached across the gallery railing, clutching her husband's hand as tears flowed freely. We're going to get through this, she whispered, her voice cracking. Across the room, Emily's small voice piped up again, unfiltered and innocent. Daddy's good. Her words, though simple, echoed into the stunned silence. The judge's stern expression softened briefly. For all his decades on the bench, he had never presided over a case where a 3-year-old became the turning point of justice. The prosecution, cornered by truth, did something unexpected. Your Honor, the lead prosecutor said carefully, in light of Agent Morrison's findings, the state withdraws its primary charges against the defendant. We move to dismiss. The gallery erupted. Spectators shouted, some cheering, others in disbelief. The defense attorney clutched his client's shoulder with shaking hands. It's over, he whispered. You're free. But the judge, measured as ever, struck the gavel. Order. This is not yet finished. While the charges are dismissed, a formal acquittal must be recorded and the record corrected. Until then, this man remains under the protection of the court. The gavel's strike reverberated like a drumbeat of justice. As reporters rushed to update their headlines, Emily's father stood slowly, chains still on his wrists. The bailiff approached, unlocking them with a click that echoed louder than any word spoken that day. His hands, finally free, trembled as he reached out to his wife, pulling her into a fierce embrace. Emily, caught between them, giggled as her father lifted her high, her small hands gripping his face. You saved me, he whispered, his voice breaking. You're my little hero. Emily just smiled, pressing her forehead to his. No bad man now. The crowd in the gallery, hardened by months of legal battles, couldn't hold back their tears. Even the jurors, sworn to neutrality, wiped their eyes. But justice wasn't done yet. As the court recessed, Agent Morrison stepped forward. "Your Honor, one last matter? Officer Harris is now in federal custody. He faces charges of evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Our inquiry will expand to review every case he touched over the last decade. This is bigger than one man's trial. It's about restoring the public's faith in justice." The judge nodded solemnly. "Then let the record show that this court will fully cooperate with that investigation." With those words, the trial that had once seemed destined to destroy an innocent man now stood as the spark that could cleanse an entire system. As the family stepped outside, the courthouse steps were swarmed with reporters and flashing cameras. Microphones thrust forward. Voices shouted over each other. "Do you believe justice was served today? How does it feel to be free after months of wrongful imprisonment? Did you know your daughter would change everything?" Emily's father shielded his family, his voice steady but emotional. "Justice was delayed, but not denied. I owe my freedom to my wife, to the truth, and most of all, to my daughter, who spoke when none of us could." The crowd erupted in applause, though some still shouted skepticism. But in that moment, the family didn't care. They were together again, and nothing mattered more. That night, as they returned home, Emily curled up in her father's arms, finally falling asleep to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He held her close, marveling at how a 3-year-old's courage had accomplished what entire teams of lawyers and investigators had failed to do. He whispered into her hair, "You reminded the world that truth doesn't need to be complicated. Sometimes it just takes 2 little words." Outside, the nation buzzed with headlines and debates, but within the quiet walls of their home, justice had unfolded. And for the first time in months, peace settled into their hearts. The courthouse was brimming with anticipation. News outlets had already framed the trial as the case broken by a child's words. Reporters stood outside, microphones ready, predicting outcomes, spinning theories. Inside, though, the atmosphere was far from sensational. It was heavy, charged with the weight of truth, finally clawing its way into the light. Emily sat quietly in the gallery with her mother, her legs swinging off the bench. She wasn't aware of the headlines or the whispered speculations. To her, the courtroom was just another big, scary room filled with too many strangers. All she knew was that her father's fate, and maybe her family's future, was being decided today. The judge returned to the bench, gavel in hand. "Court is now in session. Let us proceed." The prosecutor rose first, his voice carrying both authority and restrained emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this trial began as a straightforward criminal case. But as you've witnessed, what seemed clear-cut was anything but. A decorated officer, someone sworn to protect the truth, was found tampering with evidence, intimidating witnesses, and covering up details that could have exonerated the accused. And who first revealed that crack in the facade? A child. A 3-year-old girl who knew no politics, no legal strategy, no motive, only honesty. He paused, letting the words sink in. When Emily pointed at Officer Harris and said, "Bad man," the courtroom dismissed it as childish nonsense. Yet those words exposed corruption. Those words gave us reason to dig deeper. And what we uncovered was a web of deceit designed to ensure the defendant's conviction, regardless of his innocence. Across the aisle, the defense attorneys shifted uneasily. Their arguments had weakened day by day, each revelation slicing holes in their carefully constructed narrative. Now, the defense's last hope was to plant doubt about the thoroughness of the investigation. "Members of the jury," the defense attorney began, smoothing his tie, "I acknowledge the irregularities with Officer Harris. But that does not erase the charges. The evidence presented before his involvement remains intact. You must ask yourselves, is the defendant truly innocent, or is this merely a distraction, a convenient scapegoat to mask his guilt? The jury listened, but the weight of the revelations had tilted the balance. Too many unanswered questions. Too much manipulation. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the judge's instructions and the jury's deliberation. Hours passed. The courthouse hallways buzzed with anxious energy. Emily's mother clutched her daughter's small hand, whispering reassurances more for herself than the child. Reporters hovered near the jury room, counting the minutes, trading predictions. Finally, the bailiff called for order. The jury had reached a decision. The judge's gavel struck once. Bring in the jury. The foreman stood, a folded slip of paper in hand. His voice was steady, but the words carried the weight of history. On the charge of aggravated assault, we find the defendant, Thomas Miller, not guilty. Gasps filled the courtroom. Emily's mother broke into tears, clutching her husband's hand. Thomas Miller himself, pale and trembling, seemed almost unable to process the words. For months he had lived under a shadow, painted as a monster. Now, finally, the light broke through. But the foreman wasn't done. Furthermore, we request this court recommend a formal investigation into Officer Harris and his conduct related to this case. The judge nodded gravely. So ordered. Officer Harris will face a full inquiry into his actions. This court will not tolerate betrayal of the badge. The courtroom erupted, some in cheers, others in outrage. Reporters sprinted for the doors, desperate to file breaking news. Emily, however, only smiled, tugging her father's sleeve as he knelt to embrace her. In her innocent voice, she whispered the words that had started it all. Bad man gone. Tears streamed down Thomas's face as he kissed his daughter's forehead. Yes, sweetheart. Bad man gone. Daddy's here? The family's embrace became the defining image of the case. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled. History etched itself in that moment of raw, unfiltered relief. But the story didn't end at the courthouse. In the weeks that followed, a sweeping investigation rocked the police department. Harris was charged with misconduct, evidence tampering, and abuse of authority. His fall from grace was as dramatic as his years of decorated service had once been. Officers who had looked up to him now spoke with anger and disappointment. The community, too, demanded reform. How many other cases had been tainted by similar corruption? Meanwhile, Emily's family began piecing their lives back together. It wasn't easy. Trust, once broken, didn't mend overnight. Thomas struggled with the emotional scars of being falsely accused. Emily's mother battled anxiety, haunted by memories of Harris's intimidating visit. But through it all, Emily became their beacon of hope. At just 3 years old, she had changed the course of justice. She had reminded everyone that truth, no matter how small or unexpected its messenger, had the power to topple lies. Reporters clamored for interviews, but Emily's mother refused most requests. She's just a child, she said firmly. She doesn't need cameras or headlines. She needs a normal life. Yet, inevitably, Emily's words continued to echo far beyond their little town. Legal scholars discussed the case in classrooms, emphasizing how justice sometimes comes from the most unlikely places. Activists cited it in campaigns for greater transparency in law enforcement. And for countless families who had lost faith in the system, the story became a spark of hope. One evening, months after the verdict, Thomas sat with Emily on the porch. She was playing with a stuffed puppy, its ears floppy and worn from love. He watched her with quiet admiration, then said softly, "Do you know, Emily? You helped save Daddy." She looked up, puzzled. "I did?" "Yes," he said, pulling her close. "You told the truth. And the truth is the strongest thing in the world." Emily giggled, squeezing her toy dog. "Stronger than this puppy?" Thomas smiled, his eyes glistening. Much stronger. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, the Miller family finally felt at peace. Their story had begun with fear, betrayal, and injustice, but it ended with resilience, truth, and the unshakable bond of family. And somewhere deep down, even little Emily understood. Sometimes, even the smallest voices can roar the loudest.